The Syrian government most certainly appears to not only be expanding but also intensifying its military campaign, trying to use brute force, it would seem, to silence these voices of dissent. The most recent round of violence has forced even the Arab world to make a statement, which up until now had largely remained silent. According to eyewitnesses, residents of Deir ez-Zor, they told CNN that the tanks and bulldozers rolled in the early hours of the morning. One resident that CNN spoke to was in tears as he talked about snipers being positioned on rooftops, tanks shelling residential areas indiscriminately, homes being raided, families forced to flee. Deir ez-Zor, along with Hama, had been the scene of some of the largest demonstrations to take place in the country, and it is also a fairly significant area. The region is oil rich, but also among the country's poorest, and it is also extremely tribal, right up against the border with Iraq. In fact, it was one of the main smuggling routes for foreign fighters and weapons to support the insurgency in Iraq when it was at its peak. And tribal leaders had already vowed to fight back in the face of a military onslaught, saying that 5 months of negotiations with this government, a murderous government they called it, had failed. In Hama, the military siege there still continues, and at least 50 people were killed in a single attack by the Syrian military, it would seem, when, according to 2 eyewitnesses, a tank fired at a hospital. We also heard from an activist that 8 premature babies had died. They were relying on incubators to stay alive, and the power being cut since Wednesday, that appears to have had its impact. Residents there saying that they continue to hear the sounds of shelling and of gunfire. And in the province of Homs, yet another military onslaught there as well. And we also heard reports of Syrian security forces continuing to fire on demonstrators and even on a funeral. As we were saying, the Arab world finally speaking out about what is taking place. The Arab League issuing a statement saying that Syria must stop immediately all acts of violence and security campaigns. And the Gulf Cooperation Council added that Syria needed to put an end to the bloodshed. Not exactly the harshest of words, but still a very significant move, one that throws Syria into even greater isolation. But it seems that the more isolated Syria becomes, the more brutal and ruthless the government is. Arwa Damon, CNN, Beirut.
Beirut, almost every time we speak, we could say the same thing. It's going from bad to worse.
That's right, Wolf, and it seems like the Syrian military is not only intensifying its crackdown, but it is widening it despite all of this international condemnation. And now what we are hearing from some Arab leaders as well. On Sunday morning, troops entered the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor. Residents again reporting, as we have been hearing, indiscriminate tank shelling, arrests appearing to happen at random, snipers being stationed on rooftops, people being prevented from accessing hospitals. And in Hama, the city that we have been talking about for over a week now, the siege there continues. And there's been some disturbing video posted to YouTube. We do have to warn our viewers that they might want to turn away at this point, but it's showing how residents are being forced to turn their gardens into graveyards. In this video, you see these makeshift gravestones crudely etched with the names of just some of the victims of the regime's brutal way of handling these demonstrations. You see a number of bodies also being buried there. And so the image that continues to emerge from Syria is one of just growing and spreading brutality by this regime, Wolf.
And the latest estimates, human rights activists in Syria outside, they believe more than 2,000 people have now died in all this violence. Is that right?
That's right, Wolf. That's the latest that we're getting. Bearing in mind, though, that the estimates for Hama, where the siege began, as I was saying, over a week ago, and for Deir ez-Zor are not entirely accurate, quite simply because communications into those 2 areas has been extremely difficult. And so many activists fear that in those 2 areas alone, the death toll could be much higher than what has been predicted. And all things are pointing to one fact, or what would seem to be one fact, and that would be that this is a regime that is increasingly turning its back on reforms and seems to be more intent on using brute force to try to silence these voices of dissent. Analysts say that these are desperate actions by a regime that has never been challenged to such a degree, one that appears as if it is going to ignore even the Arab leadership as long as it is confident that it still has an ally in Iran. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the government reacts in the coming days, and especially what sort of statement, if any, comes out of Iran, Wolf.
It's interesting, these three Arab countries recalling their ambassadors from Damascus. Arwa, thanks very much, Saudi.